Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about the lack of command control in pitched melee battles, historically, in pre-modern times. So in pre-modern times, the rule pretty much was that generals weren't not able to control much of the battlefield once the battle started. Now that happens sometimes in some game systems, but it was true in all of pre-modern reality. So what makes sense historically is not necessarily what game players want. Warfare is full of chance and chaos, whereas game players prefer to have control of their own fate. Though this varies stylistically, improvisers don't mind the chaos and uncertainty as much as planners do. So many commanders knew that fighting a pitched battle was very chancy. Charlemagne fought as few as 2 pitched battles while conquering much of Western Europe. Instead of relying on fighting, he relied on superior organization and logistics. He, for example, more or less wiped out the Avars without really fighting any big battle. Now, Phil Sabin points out in his book, Simulating Battles, that in ancient times it was very difficult to force a battle. There were no supply lines to threaten, and it was very hard to attack fortifications. So standoffs lasting many days weren't unusual. If one side felt at disadvantage, they'd hole up in a fortified camp or in a city, or otherwise stay out of reach. Or did occupy such good terrain that the other side wouldn't attack. You could just about say that most battles, barring the very rare ambush, were by agreement, if not by appointment. So, how did the commander influence the battle? Part of his influence came from how he set up his forces, although there seems to have been a great deal of standardization in how forces got set up. Cavalry on one side, cavalry on the other side, infantry in the middle. But also the commander could influence the battle with the forces who accompanied him. For example, Alexander the Great's companion cavalry. You could make a case that Alexander's claim to great generalship came from how active he was during a battle. Of course, in games we have artificial player influence because the player usually controls every unit. Now, miniatures battles, that's not always true, especially where you have several players on each side. The commander may give orders, but then you have all the problems of orders being misunderstood or simply ignored. And this varies greatly from one rule set to another. Of course, some rule sets manage to give surprisingly little control, even if there's only one player per side. It reminds me of the time problem in miniatures battles. That being that the battles take much less model time than real battles did. That is, you figure out how far troops can march in a certain number of minutes, and you play 6 or 7 turns, and they haven't marched all that far, but the battle's over. Now, in video games, most of the war games in video games are actually resource management games. And the player should always win because he'll figure out superior resource management and then be able to build an unstoppable army or navy or air force, whatever it is. Now there are hardcore tabletop style video war games, but they are obscure. They only sell a few thousand copies, just like tabletop war games. I haven't played them, so I don't know how the command control conundrum is treated. Now my experience fairly recently, 10 years, 12 years ago, of designing a Hastings 1066 game, I wanted a very small, simple game to play. But I arranged it realistically, and that led to too little control by the player in what is already a chancy game. So I had to make it less like reality, that is to say, make it a weaker model to cater to game players. And that's the problem that historical game designers run into. Serious war game players want to control their fate, want to feel that they are at fault if they lose. Of course, there's a big trend towards solo games in historical war games, and there you don't care so much because you're not opposed by another person. Historical gamers rarely want to be in a realistic situation where they may have little influence on the outcome during the fight. Remember, sometimes warfare and games are polar opposites, and that's what we're running into here. Thanks for listening.